Good evening, and thank you for tuning in to another Dr. Myrna Minute as we continue to explore Destiny Focus, Destiny Unveiled for 2025. Tonight, we will continue to look at the prophet Jeremiah's call story, concluding the unveiling of his story. Remember to like, share, and comment. Like, share, and comment, and please subscribe if you have not already. Our initial study of Jeremiah demonstrated when we put things off by making excuses, we can derail or delay our purpose. However, the call story of Jeremiah showed us the power of God and Jeremiah's obedience to the voice of God and giving in to the voice of God, which leads us to our lesson this evening, which we will be able to see the unveiling of his story in verse 10. But first, let's do a recap. In episode 1, we learned the call story of Jeremiah looking at chapters 1, focusing on verses 4 through 7, which taught us the importance of acceptance, acknowledgement, and pursuing purpose. In episode 2, we focused on verse 8, which allowed us to explore the impact of fear, right? And it also allowed us to explore why are we fearful? Why are we afraid? And why are we allowing fear to be used as an excuse that can keep us from purpose? In episode 3, we examine verse 9 and the impact of the role of our emotions relevant to our purpose from both a psychological and a theological lens. And we also was able to see the power of God and the promise of God from a theological perspective. So we learned the power of God and the promise of God relevant to the prophet's call story. So each viewpoint offered us a frame of reference that allows us to explore and gain a deeper understanding and insight into how we can understand our relationship with God, the value and importance of being obedient and faithful, so that we can get to a place that we're going to see in verse 10 of the unveiling of our purpose, which will allow us to receive, accept, trust, and believe. So, also in episode 3, we also highlighted when we receive, when we accept, when we trust, and when we believe God, and how all of those impact our ability to be able to get to the place where our narrative can be unveiled, our purpose can be unveiled. And so tonight, as we conclude with verse 10, examining the unveiling of purpose, I want us just to be mindful, put your thoughts in the chat, be able to center yourself so that we can hear from God on this evening. Let us go to the throne of grace. Oh, gracious and all wise God, we thank you for this evening. We thank you for allowing us to make it this far. And God, we thank you that you are continuing to speak into our lives, oh God. God, we thank you that you are centering us and getting us on focus so we can focus on you, focus on your will, focus on your way, focus on the identity that you have given to us, that we may be able to walk into the unveiling of our purpose that you gave us before we were even conceived in our mother's womb. So, God, we thank you that your mercy and your grace have kept us. God, we thank you that you continue to sustain us. God, we thank you that your word is forever allowing us to be renewed, changed, and transformed so that we can begin to see ourselves through your lens and take hold of the identity given to us by you. And so, right now in this space, God, we cast aside every concern. We cast aside every weight. We cast aside every burden, oh God, and we focus on hearing what you are speaking to each of us. God, I pray that as the lesson goes forth, that your people and all those who are listening and will watch the replay will hear your voice so that each of us may align with your will and your way and walk into purpose, allowing us to be used by you. So, God, we thank you that we are already overcomers. We thank you, oh God, as we align to your word and to the purpose that you have for us. God, we thank you that you have given us an identity of victory and of overcomers. In your son, Jesus the Christ's name, we pray. We say amen and ashe, amen and ashe. So we know that There is power in the word of God, especially in our text when the prophet Jeremiah tells his call story and demonstrate to us the posture of God, a posture of a relational God, a posture of a God who was present all throughout chapters 1, verses 1 through 10, right? And so for your hearing this evening, I just want to read verse 10 to you. It says, "See, today I appoint you over nations and over kingdoms, to pluck up and to pull down, to destroy and to overthrow, to build and to plant." So, the first thing that we are able to see in our text this evening is the power of God when we accept our purpose, right? When we take heed to the voice of God and we receive what God is saying, God will unveil what we are called to do relevant to our purpose. So, in our text, we can identify the unveiling of the purpose of the prophet, right? Because in the previous verses, we saw where he accepted and he was able to center himself in the presence of God, to accept, to receive, to trust, and to believe in what God was speaking over his life, right? So in the lessons previously, we learned that Jeremiah was able to encounter his identity and who he was through the voice of God. It was through the voice of God that Jeremiah learned his identity from the Creator. So this evening, I want you to put your thoughts in the chat. What is your purpose? What is your purpose? So reflect on what is your purpose as we continue to explore the unveiling of the prophet's story. So verse 10 allows us to see the prophet Jeremiah unveil. His purpose is unveiled in verse 10. But in verses 4 and 9, we learn that God communicates to us concerning our purpose and concerning who God created us to be and become, right? So we learned that from conception, God identified us and God had already told us what we would be, right? Because we were created with purpose and we were created with the intent to be used by God to glorify God. And so we also learned that there is no need for us to make excuses. So in the previous verses, we learned how Jeremiah made an excuse because he identified himself as a boy. And so, how many of us can relate to that when we identify ourselves through our lens rather than the lens of God? And so, and the next thing we learned was the impact of fear, right? Fear can impact our ability to walk in purpose, right? And we can see how the prophet Jeremiah, God told him not to fear, that he would be delivered from the fear, which is a word that each of us can take hold to and be encouraged and know that no matter what emotions we may be experiencing to what God is calling us to, that we don't have to worry and we don't have to fear because God has us. So God provides us with God's assurance. Also, we learned that God can be trusted, right? God can be trusted, and that before we were even formed in our womb, God already had a plan and a purpose for us, right? And maybe along the way, we have encountered some experience that may have led us away from purpose and maybe even led us away from God. But our lesson is encouraging us that we can trust God and that we can rest in the assurance that God has for our life. Then we learn Jeremiah's purpose is not in his strength and not in his ability, but in God's strength, right? Jeremiah is going to be able to carry out his purpose because God provided him what he needed in order to carry it out. And lastly, we get to verse 10 on this evening. Jeremiah's call story is unveiled, shifting us from his title as prophet to the role and what God is calling him to carry out, right? Demonstrating for each of us that we are the ones who need to avail ourselves to God so that we can begin to, number one, identify ourselves through the lens of God and not take heed or not continue to walk under the hindrances of the voices of other people who may have said we are something else or may have identified us as anything except who God has identified us as. So God was calling the prophet over nations and kingdoms, and everything he needed was already provided to him by God. right? So the lesson for us is that we only need to trust and believe God. And we need to be able to embrace the identity that God has already given to us. That means we have to deconstruct from a psychological perspective. We have to deconstruct the negative narrative or identity that we have internalized for ourselves, right? This will allow us to shift from a negative perspective or identity of who we are to be able to shift to the identity given to us by God. Jeremiah needed to be able to see his purpose. So that's why in verse 10, it's important for us to understand the impact and the weight of the word see in verse 10, which signifies for us that we need to see our purpose in order to walk in it. So Jeremiah needed to see his purpose and the weight of his purpose and what God was calling him to so that he can have the strength to be able to walk in it. Because God was calling Jeremiah to judge and to witness, to provide hope and assurance, and to offer renewal and rebirth into the lives of those whom he was called to serve. So God is waiting for us to trust God. God is waiting for us to depend on God. God is waiting for us to look to God and not to look to ourselves in order for our purpose to be unveiled, right? Knowing that it's not about us being perfect, it's not about us having it all together, but it is about us trusting and believing in the God who created us and who already had a plan and a purpose for our life. So our calling and our purpose is not about us and what we can do, but it is about the power and the ability to God to be able to work in us and through us. So everything that you need, everything that I need is within us. And whatever else is needed relevant to the call that God is calling us to, God will lead us to it, right? And so for the prophet Jeremiah, the text tells us that God put God's words in Jeremiah, right? Because Jeremiah was the mouthpiece of God. So relevant to your purpose, relevant to your destiny, who God is calling you to be and become, God will provide you with the resources that you need in order to walk out the purpose and the plan that God has for your life. So this series is designed to get us to a place where we can consider and we can examine any habits or hindrances we may have that may be keeping us from walking into and accepting our purpose, right? Because we want to be able to accept our purpose. We want to be able to walk in it, and so we can be able to see our purpose unveiled. So here we can hear and see God through the prophet Jeremiah's call story speaking to us today, right? But how many of us know that in order for us to see what God is saying to us, we first need to have a relationship with God and know the voice of God so that we can see, hear, and respond to the voice of God. We also need to trust God and what God has spoken over our life. Sometimes we can experience issues or dilemmas or certain experience in our life that can pull us away from God, that can pull us away from our relationship with God, right? But our study of the prophet Jeremiah offers us hope, right? It tells us the power of God and that when we trust God, there is nothing that we're not going to be able to do because our trust is not in us, our trust is in God. And moreover, that when we trust God, we avail ourselves to hear from God, and most importantly, to know our identity and who God has called us to be through God's perspective and not through our past. Right? Because when we focus on our past and who we used to be and who we was, and maybe even who we are now, that can limit us from being able to hear and see what God is trying to do in our life as we look at purpose. So just know that you were already created for a specific plan and a specific purpose. That means you have a specific destiny that God already provided to you. You only need to trust God and be able to walk in it. So, in closing, our takeaways is that God will provide what we need. But first, we must receive, we must accept, we must trust, and we must believe God. It's important for us to stop looking to the past and begin to look at the future. What is God speaking to you now? Put your thoughts in the chat. What is God speaking to you? Who has God called you to be and become? What has God called you to give up or change in your life in order for you to walk into your purpose, in order for your purpose and your destiny to be unveiled to you by God, right? Because the prophet Jeremiah's unveiling of his purpose was given to him by God. God told him that he was supposed to be over nations and kingdoms, and not only be over nations and kingdoms, but what it entailed, right? And so, what is God speaking to you? What is God speaking to you? Also, have you quieted yourself and made time to hear from God, right? That's also important. We have to make sure that we quiet ourselves and make time to spend with God so we can hear the voice of God when God is speaking to us, okay? So the first thing is to receive. The first thing we need to do is to receive the same way that the prophet Jeremiah had to receive what God was saying to him. And we know that he received what God was saying to him because right now in verse 10, we see the unveiling of his purpose, which lets us know that the prophet did not stay in a state of fear. He did not stay in a state of making excuses or procrastination, but he was able to receive what God was speaking to him. And so, for us to be encouraged by the prophet's call story, we too need to receive what God is speaking to us. And so, what God may be saying to me in this season may be different from what he's saying to you. But what he's saying is what matters, right? And we need to be able to receive what God is speaking to us today, this evening, at this moment, right? So, what is God saying to you that will allow you to let go of your fear, to let go of your doubt, to let go of the hindrances, to let go of the habits, and to let go of anything that may be keeping you from walking into your purpose and allowing your purpose to be unveiled to you by God? The next thing we see is accept. Jeremiah had to accept his identity in order for him to accept his purpose, in order for his purpose to be unveiled to him. Have you accepted the identity given to God by you? Or are you still living under the auspices of a narrative or an identity that's been given to you by your past, that's been given to you by other people? Or are you ready and are you prepared to be able to accept the identity that God has given to you before you were conceived in your mother's womb? Right? So, no matter what you've gone through up to this point, no matter what you've experienced, no matter how other people have identified you, at this point, it is time for you to be able to make space to hear from God and to accept your God given identity, not the identity of your trauma, not the identity of your pain, not the identity of your rejection, not the identity of fear, not the identity of doubt, not the identity that you are not good enough. None of those matter, right? The only identity that matters is the identity given to you by God, right? But first, we must deconstruct from a psychological perspective all of those other identities so that we can reframe and accept the identity given to us by God. When we accept the identity given to us by God, it's going to allow our minds to be transformed. It's going to allow our eyes to see past our past experience, to be able to see our present and how our present is going to take us into our future, right? And so, thirdly, we have to learn how to trust. Jeremiah had to trust God in order to accept and receive his promise, to accept and receive his identity, to accept and receive his purpose and his destiny, right? And so, God is calling us to trust in God, not in what we have, not in our abilities, not in other people, not what people have said, right? But to trust God. And we have to begin to trust God with our whole being and know that everything we need in order to walk this thing out, God will provide. So it's important that we trust God and stop looking at our ability, right? And look at God, because God is not limited. And every resource that we need in order to walk into purpose, God will provide to us. So we can trust God. And lastly, we have to believe, right? We have to believe God. We have to believe the promises of God, the promise that God has already spoken over our life. We have to know that before we were created in the womb of our mother, that God already had a plan for us. And not just any plan. He had a plan and a purpose for us, a specific plan with a specific destiny. The only thing we need to do is believe, right? And so what happens when we believe is that we shift. Our perspective shift, how we think shift, our outlook shifts, our identity shifts, how we allow others to perceive us, all of that shifts, right? Because our belief is not in ourselves or our past or in anybody else, but our belief is in God. Our belief is the word and the promises spoken over our life by God, right? By our creator, by the one who created us, right? So we must believe, right? We must believe in order for our thinking to shift, in order for our vision to open up so we can see who God is calling us to be and become in this season. So I want to encourage us that we no longer focus on the thoughts of others or the opinions of others or our past mistakes when we didn't get it right, because God is not calling us to perfection. God is calling us to trust God and to believe in God and to accept and to receive the promises that God has already spoken our life so that we can accept our purpose and so that our destiny can be unveiled, right? When we receive, accept, trust God, and believe in God. So just like the prophet Jeremiah's purpose is unveiled to him, our purpose can be unveiled to us. Our purpose and our destiny and where God is trying to call us to in this season can be unveiled to us. But we first have to receive, accept, trust God, and believe, right? It's necessary to receive, accept, trust, and believe God in order for us to walk into our purpose and walk into our destiny so that we can be and become everything that God is calling us to be and become. And so, from a psychological lens, unveiling the purpose in our lives, we must deconstruct negative ways of thinking. Because how many of us know negative ways of thinking can hinder us and delay us from walking into purpose? So we need to be able to receive, accept, trust, and believe from a psychological lens too. Because when we are able to do that, it helps us to deconstruct any negative ways of thinking. It helps us to better manage our emotions that may be keeping us from purpose, right? And it allows us to see that our purpose has already been established, right? It has already been established. God has already provided us that promise. We only need to receive, accept, trust, and believe God. And so, also from a psychological lens, when we begin to process these emotions or the spirit of fear or any other emotion that may be keeping us from walking into our purpose, when we receive, accept, trust, and believe, it allows us to deconstruct and to move forward, right? Because how many of us know that when we operate out of fear or we operate out of disappointment or we operate out of rejection or any other emotion that can keep us from walking into purpose, it can hold us back and cause us to be stagnant, right? And sometimes when we operate out of this perspective relevant to a psychological lens, we become stuck. But on this evening, God is calling us to become unstuck. God is calling us to receive. God is calling us to accept, trust, and believe God. And when we do this, our negative experiences, right, they won't be negated and they won't go away, but we will be able to better process. We will be able to develop healthier coping skills, and we will no longer be living under the weight of habits, both from a cognitive perspective, right, as well as the emotional perspective, because we will learn how to trust in God and know, because in the text, God promised Jeremiah that he would be delivered from his emotion of fear. And so the same promise that God gave to Jeremiah, God also gives to us, right? So we have a word of encouragement, right? That we have to do is trust and believe God and know that we shall be delivered and that it's okay. We no longer have to hold on to negative emotions or negative ways of thinking or anything that can hinder us and keep us from not only walking in destiny, but for our destiny to be unveiled. Right. And so when we begin to process and deal with our habits and behaviors, then we are able to fully see our purpose, fully see our promise, and fully walk in the fullness of God in that thing that God has called us to do. Right. It also allows us to deconstruct our negative identification of the self. Right. And be able to reframe and reauthor ourselves through the lens of God when we take on the identity given to us by God and not the identity of our past, not the identity of broken experiences, not the identity of pain and harm, but the identity given to us by God, right? Meaning we externalize the negative and we allow God to reauthor our story. And lastly, from a theological perspective of receiving, accepting, trusting, and believing God, if we need help, all we have to do is ask God, right? We don't have to be silent. We don't have to be silent in our pain, right? God allows us to avail ourselves to God, get in the presence of God, and be able to lament and to cry out, right? So that if there is a pain that you are experiencing, if there's anything that you're going through that's hindering you from receiving, accepting, trusting, and believing God and who God has called you to be, you only need to go to God and ask for help, right? Because your emotion is not going to put God in a position where God takes back your purpose or takes back the promises spoken over your life. They've been spoken, right? So the destiny that God has for you is already stamped on you. In our lesson, when we look at the prophet Jeremiah call story, it encourages us to know that God can handle our emotions, right? And God will deliver us from what we need to be delivered from. We only need to trust God, right? We only need to trust God and believe and know that God will do it. And when we do this, there's a power shift. When we walk into our purpose, when we're able to receive, accept, trust, and believe God and what God has spoken to our lives, right? When we do that, there is a shift. There's a shift for us to receive healing. There's a shift for us to be transformed. There's a shift for our eyes to be able to see things differently, for us to see ourselves differently, which will allow us to see our value, right? And that's another thing that God introduced to Jeremiah. God introduced Jeremiah's value to him when he demonstrated who he was called to be, right? He was valuable. And that's why we can see the power in Jeremiah's call story, right? And the same way that God has spoke into Jeremiah is the same way that God is speaking into us. We only need to receive, accept, trust, and believe God so that we can walk into the fullness of who God is calling us to be and become, so that we can walk into destiny and see our purpose unveiled. So our experiences of brokenness and other experience don't negate the call or the purpose that God has for us, right? So don't believe the lies of the enemy when the enemy tells you that you can't because of this, all right? Or you can't because you did this, or you can't because you look like this, or you can't because you live on this side of town. All of those are lies, right? Because before you were formed in your mother's womb, God already had a plan and a purpose for your life, meaning you already was destined to do and be who God is calling you to in this season. You only need to receive, accept, trust, and believe God. So God has identified us already. So it's time in this season for us to live out the identity given to us by God and deconstruct any negative attachment to any other identity that's not of God. So any negative voice, any negative word curse that's been spoken over you, you need to deconstruct that. You need to cast that down to the pits of hell and know that you are not that. You are only who God says you are, right? You only have to receive, accept, trust, and believe who God says you are and walk into that identity. It's that identity that's going to give you the strength and courage you need in order for you to walk in purpose and for your destiny to be unveiled in your life. So I want to encourage you to see past experiences. I want to encourage you not to live in fear. I want to encourage you not to allow harmful experiences or trauma or anything else to hinder you from your purpose, right? God desires for you to walk in purpose and for your destiny to be unveiled, right? And we do that when we receive, accept, trust, and believe God, because God is the giver of our destiny. So, what's your destiny, right? Theologian and philosopher Augustine states, "For you made us for yourself, and our hearts are restless until they find their rest in you," right? So, when we look at this quote from the theologian and the philosopher of Augustine, we are able to determine the power of our destiny. And our ability to receive, accept, trust, and believe God has to do with our yielding and trusting and relying on God, has to do with our ability to just look to God. It has to do with our ability to begin this spiritual journey, right? Begin to seek God at a deeper level. Begin to make space to hear the voice of God over your life so that you can walk into every promise that God has spoken over your life. So God has revealed to each of us that just like Augustine, we need to reflect on our spiritual path that connects with God. Because sometimes our purpose or our destiny can be derailed because we're not in alignment with God. We're not in alignment with God. And that hinders us from hearing the voice of God over our life. And so I pray that you are in a space and that you are in a season of readiness where you can receive, accept, trust, and believe God and know that God has a specific purpose and plan for your life. And as always, I hope that you have enjoyed this lesson. I pray that something that I shared has been planted on good ground and that you take the initiative to water this seed. Also, I want to thank you again for tuning in to another Dr. Myrna Minute. I look forward to gathering in community with you on Friday, April the 4th at 8 p.m. as we continue to examine Destiny Focus, Destiny Unveiled. Be blessed and enjoy your weekend. And if you have any questions or if you would like to reach out to me, don't hesitate to contact me at transform@drmyrna.com. Be blessed and enjoy your weekend.